we're speaking here about places that are difficult to work in according to typical models of development. So these are kind of places that are on the margins of the international system, but they're not marginal populations. There are actually hundreds of millions of people who live in places affected by conflict and fragility.
That's Amir Khouzam, a research associate at think tank ODI Global. Amir is talking about the conflict blind spot in development. The fact that while many of the world's poorest people live in fragile or conflict-affected places, they receive very little of available climate or development funding. Working in fragile and conflict-affected places is tricky. Donors and development funds often see fragile countries as too risky to invest in. Most of the funding which does enter flows to humanitarian response. But this focus on coping with crises isn't building the long-term resilience people need to adapt to future shocks. Welcome to Dynamics Drylands. I'm Bola Mosoro, a journalist and broadcaster, and I've been reporting for the past 30 years. In this episode, we'll be hearing from Amir and Musaed Aklan. They're two people who are working to close the conflict blind spot in development finance. We'll be hearing about why the international aid community can't afford to ignore these contexts and what entry points exist for donors and development workers looking to make a difference. First, what do we mean by fragile countries?
I think there are a lot of terms that we use to describe these countries, protracted crises or conflict-affected settings. I think what we really mean is countries or regions within countries where institutions are very weak or are fully engaged in looking at other issues and so are not necessarily working on the kind of questions of development that might be present in a more stable setting. Often these are countries that are affected by security concerns or by conflict, and sometimes they're places where the state is not actually fully present at all and doesn't have control over parts of its territory.
The fact that these countries are often ranked as the most vulnerable to disasters, including climate change, is not some geographical accident. In fact, people living in these places are much more vulnerable to shocks because they don't have the institutions or government support they need. Amir explains.
People are very vulnerable in these settings. They're vulnerable to shocks, and those shocks include climate shocks in storms and droughts and extreme weather. And because they're so vulnerable, they have very little in reserve. Those shocks hit harder in these places. So it's absolutely essential that we work on resilience building and climate adaptation in these places. But unfortunately, it's some of these places that are receiving the least amount of support because of the difficulties that come with operating in these settings. I think one example where these things really come together is a place like Niger. Niger is a country where it's really obvious how climate risks, long-term environmental degradation, and conflict affect people. You have very dramatic instances of the desert almost swallowing people's land and changes in patterns of communities who have long been mobile and moved in response to access to resources and other dynamics, but are now moving into areas where there are existing communities of farmers. Sometimes this is leading to competition or new interactions between communities. And there's an absence of the state there to manage these tensions. And at the same time, you have trans-border conflict, you have migration, you have displacement from conflict in neighboring countries, you have non-state armed groups who are present in part of the country. And then a few years ago, you had a change in the government where the military replaced the previous authorities. And so this has led to a whole set of new barriers to working in a country like Niger. Western governments are limited in what they can do with the government of Niger. There are sanctions and legal restrictions on development. And the kind of support that country has been reaching has reverted almost to traditional humanitarian assistance. But you still have all these risks, and actually they're getting worse.
That was Amir Khouzam. Climate change is only making people in fragile countries more vulnerable. Let's turn now to Musaed Aklan, a specialist in water and climate change with Yemen's Sahna Center for Strategic Studies.
Climate change plays a critical role in Yemen's ongoing crisis. It increased tensions and conflict among the Yemeni population. So in recent years, Yemen has experienced an average of one cyclone per year, which increased dramatically compared to the historical pattern of one cyclone every 5 to 6 years. This more frequent of cyclones, floods have affected the communities, local communities, and the fishermen, destroying homes, infrastructures, and overall livelihoods. The storms have caused severe flooding, which not only threatens lives and property, but also displacement camps, worsening humanitarian conditions, and has introduced even saltwater intrusion into the coastal areas and agriculture lands. So the impact of climate change is increasing and it's impacting a lot. Even if Yemen is not contributing to this change itself, but it is one of the countries impacted a lot by climate change.
But Musaid makes clear that Yemen's ongoing crisis isn't just because of climate change. Yemen's recent history of war, fragile governance, and deep fragmentation makes people more vulnerable to shocks like floods.
Yemen today is facing a mix of complexity, a lot of problems, environmental governance, conflict, and political issues. In Yemen, the conflict with governance and environmental challenges feed into each other, creating a critical cycle of problems. Today, half of all water facilities have been destroyed or impacted by fighting, forcing many families to walk hours just to find water, and many millions of people have been displaced from their local areas. So, for example, water crisis was very critical before the war, and now it is even worse in terms of the water quality, quantity, accessibility, and affordability. Today, most of the Yemenis, including 8.6 million children, lack safe water access. And this scarcity often sparks violence between communities themselves. So the governance weaknesses and political instability and collapse and breakdown makes things worse.
Musaid and Amir make it clear that politics and conflict have a direct impact on how people in Niger and Yemen are able to cope with shocks like flooding. Aid and climate actors need to address these root causes if they're to make any headway in building people's resilience. It is tricky, but it can be done. Let's hear from both again, starting with Musaid.
Work in conflict affected countries is very critical, very risky, but it's very important and very needed, because without working in these countries, conflict affected countries, means the local will suffer a lot, which most of them are not a part of this conflict. So one of the points to support these countries is to ease the requirements of getting these funds, accelerate the process, which takes years sometimes for a single project. Climate financing should not be in the formal loans, but also I consider this as a right for these countries. It should be focused more also in the adaptations rather than mitigation projects. So opening the climate finance windows for those countries is very important, and integrating conflict sensitivity and risk-informed approach are very important. Working through locals and strengthening local leadership and ownership and ensure the future sustainability of these projects is also one of the key success point for any interventions, for any funds.
Amir expands on the issue of positive intervention.
There are a lot of things we can do to start now and to respond. And there has been work beyond Spark and beyond ODI to look more broadly at what kind of action works in these settings. One is that programs that are very deeply context specific and very informed by the actual realities and experiences of the people living in these settings usually work. What we've also found is that the assumption that the more fragile or the more intense a conflict, the less can be done, is not always true. There is always action that is taking place. It might vary in form and vary in style and might not look like traditional climate action, but almost everywhere we've looked something is possible. And in fact, actions to mitigate risk, longer term risk, are taking place. They're just taking place at a very small scale. So one thing that international actors who are used to operating at quite a big scale can do is start with what is already happening and start to scale it up.
Amir Khouzam. This is a story about structural problems. When people don't have the support they need, a shock like a flood or a drought can quickly turn into a disaster. Tackling the messy political factors which make people vulnerable to shocks is understandably difficult. But as Musaed and Amir make clear, entry points do exist, and donors can no longer afford to turn a blind eye. And we finish with Amir.
I think for not just donors, but for everyone involved in the response to longer-term risks, climate change, and environmental degradation in complex settings, the reason to engage now is because the cost to not doing so in the future will be enormous. And first and foremost, those are costs borne by people who live in those countries and these settings themselves.
Thank you to Amir Khouzam and Musaed Aklan for their expertise. And thank you for listening to Dynamic Drylands. I'm Bola Mosuru. In the next episode, we hear how farming communities recover from the ravages of conflict and what they can teach us about the best ways to support them.
In almost all cases, agriculture recovered strongly, perhaps more strongly than anyone could have hoped, and that much of the increase in production was coming from small farms. And now, how were smallholders doing that? Well, it was very simply by hard work. They were going back to their fields which had often been abandoned for many years. Nevertheless, the increases in production were very, very considerable. And so output grew rapidly when peace was restored. But very surprisingly, they got very, very little support from their governments to do so. They saw small farms, not very technical. They saw that as poverty and the past.
Dynamic Drylands is produced by the Research to Action programme SPARK, supporting pastoralism and agriculture in recurrent and protracted crises. It was funded with UK aid from the UK government and managed by Co-Water International, in partnership with the International Research Institute, Mercy Corps and ODI Global. Thank you to everyone who contributed to this series. For more information about the issues discussed in this podcast, visit the links in the show notes.